So in part four, we are going to really move into this idea of examining instruction, because this is, really what's going to help you to develop your action plan, and really to bring to life, the sense of, the problem of practice and, what we need to actually work on. So we'll talk a little bit about the problems of practice when it comes to examining instruction. We'll also talk about ways in which you can learn about instruction. And so, big term right now is learning walks. And just the wording itself lends itself to, you're learning from walking around the building, visiting classrooms, and it's helping you to better understand what's going on and where we need to go. And then we'll end by just talking about how you leverage trust. And trust is going to be a biggie. And it's funny, I was just recently interviewed for an academic coach in our district. And, one of the teachers who was interviewing said, I know I'm going to need to work on, establishing trust. And the question was, well, what does that look like? What are the things that you will do to garner trust from your faculty? So let's just start by thinking about problems of practice when you are, examining instruction, right? And so the first one, as educators, we sometimes tend to focus on external factors, right? Well, the students didn't read at home, or the students didn't practice their math facts or their sight words, right? So there's lots of like fill in the blank kind of reasons why kids aren't making progress. And as I've said before, when you point a finger, there's three pointing back. So you want to move from acknowledging external factors to acknowledging what is it that we have control over when they are here. And that's going to be important. Another factor to consider is when you are talking about examining instruction and observing practice, not all teachers are coming to the table with the same expertise or background on that. The if you think about chapter five, the happy talk, right, and moving them from that kind of general great job, the kids were so engaged, to more specific and precise labeling, that's going to be, important in talking about the work that you do. So, your students were really cognitively engaged while they had to turn and talk to their partner, and each partner had to listen in on what their partner was saying in order to be able to share out with the group what their partner said. And so that's something very specific and tangible that you can really put onto that. Um, you want to think about closed doors, right? And so that we know that not all teachers see the person down the hall, across the hall, the academic coach, or someone as a resource. And so, while everybody comes to teaching with a different slant or different take on how to present or organize learning, we can all learn from one another and certainly observe someone's practice and then be able to take that into our own. So time and fear, last two kind of big problems of practice, right? And so, time is a precious resource in schools. We're always thinking about, fitting it all in, right? And so we want to start thinking about, how can we start to use time creatively? Is there a way that a teacher could provide coverage so that a grade level could, plan and assess student writing as a team so that they can, better prepare their students as writers and, kind of identify strengths and needs in the curriculum or in the classroom so that they can, perhaps remediate that. Is there time we can create, for teachers to go observe one another, even if it's small amounts of time? Any little bit you can eke out is certainly worth it. And then, of course, fear. I think we all had that fear about, not doing, not doing a good job for our students. We're always afraid of someone's going to come in and tell us we're doing something wrong or it's supposed to be done this way, not that way. I can tell you personally, as a teacher, I kept waiting for someone to come in and tell me that I was a bad teacher, and this was the observation that they were going to get rid of me. And even now, as an administrator, even teaching this course, it's the first time. This course has only been offered 2 times, and there's no other professor for me to say, "Hey, how did you do that?" And so, I fortunately work very closely with Tina, and ask her, "Hey, here's what I did for this. What do you think? This is the feedback I got from the exit tickets," and so I can use her to help me be a better professor. But that takes a while for people to get in the process of using that kind of an approach. So I'm going to use an example of something we did in our district to help us with this process. We had been implementing word study with using word journeys by Kathy Gonski since 2006. And somewhere about 4 or 5 years ago, we started thinking, we often would get complaints from teachers or parents about students not applying their word study skills when they're writing. And so we looked at their spelling scores and the like. And so this was the question that, we as a team wanted to answer. And so we created a process for doing learning walks where we could visit classrooms and find out a little bit more about how word study was being implemented in the classrooms, and specifically about getting our students to apply their word knowledge. That those learning walks involved voluntary teams of teachers and administrators who went on a schedule to observe word study in the classrooms, and those schedules were shared with teachers ahead of time, so it was not a mystery when they were coming. And then we had drafted, or not drafted, we shared the checklist that we would be using with the observers so that the people being observed didn't wonder what we were looking at or looking for. One of the things, if you're, have been through the Westchester Reading Program, or just as a reading specialist, you've probably looked at Words Their Way or Word Journeys. Both come from the same research. And so we really, as a group of teachers and administrators, came to the realization that our students were memorizing the words and those spelling discoveries for the test each week, but then they weren't carrying it over into their writing. And so we wanted to, identify ways that we could address that, but we had to better understand what was going on in the classrooms first. And so we, really came to this conclusion about, the problems of practice, right? That some of the teachers didn't actually understand some of their own discoveries related to spelling patterns. If you're familiar with Words Their Way or Word Journeys, it's not a canned program. It's not a manual, right? And so, especially when you get to certain spelling features, for example, the schwa, there are, the teacher really has to have strong knowledge of what that is in order to be able to teach that understanding to their students. In addition, the teachers would have activities for students to practice word study throughout the week. And in the absence of a manual, some of the teachers, really, kind of relied on each other or perhaps Pinterest for coming up with word study activities that the students could, interact with those words throughout the week. And so, without, like I said, in the absence of a manual, the teacher who's doing that research, may not um, be aware that those activities may or may not be effective. And so we'll talk about how we address that. So if you've been through the Westchester program, you'll recognize this checklist for word study instruction. And so this was the checklist we use when observing teachers. And this comes from Dr. Flanagan in 505, as well as you probably would have had it being used when you were teaching in 5 512 or 532. And those of you who are not part of the reading specialist program at West Chester, you certainly can pause here and read through that. Using Charlotte Danielson's framework for teaching, we created a checklist for the activities and assignments in word study. And so we went from looking at activities being most effective to less effective. And that was a careful word choice. We try not to put good or bad or, kind of an inference on it. We came up with descriptors, if you look at it, for why an activity perhaps was less effective. And just a quick example of uh, two of those. We know that word study is the goal is to bring students' attention to patterns in words. And so if you're doing something like ABC order, that only looks at the beginning of a word. And so if you're looking at vowel teams or schwa, which might be in the middle or the second syllable, you may not actually look at those spelling features. I've seen some other convoluted activities where students turn letters into numbers and then total the numbers up, which really that's the way from looking at the patterns. And so then over a most effective, you can see students are really practicing and looking at their own writing to determine whether or not perhaps they've spelled those words correctly or not. So we went, like I said, we went around to buildings and teams. We observed every classroom in the district with various observers, and we came up with some results. So we took the data, we collected the data, organized the data into a data display, and you'll see, just to orient you, this first bar represents the observation that we did in October. Okay, so and each grade level is a different color. Gray is the district average. And so there's kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth, fifth, and sixth is red. And so in October, after we did that observation, we provided professional development in November. And then we went back and did a second learning walk in December. And you can see that just the activities alone went from being, this percent to across the board 100%. And part of this, we provided a model for teachers to use to come up with those activities. When we asked students what they were learning in word study, and keep in mind it was just 1 month time, saw a general increase in students' ability to explain their patterns. We saw the least growth in sixth grade, and some of that, when we looked at which patterns they struggled with, it was often related to those with syllable doubling and the schwa. And then the last one, could students show or explain what they were learning in their writing? And here's where we saw the students were able to point out examples more clearly than they were able to articulate without that reference to show an observer. So we would ask the kids to show us some evidence of what it is that they've learned, and we saw an increase in that too. And of course, we had to revisit practice after that December. So we know in this process we focused a lot on building trust. So we were very transparent. We had clear expectations about what we were going to see and what we were looking for. We involved teachers at each step. So in the data collection, in examining and the data and organizing it, and then the feedback to peers. We modeled the expectations. So what an effective activity look like? What does an effective word study sort instruction look like? We revisited the process as needed. And of course, we celebrated growth, as I've noted, is something of importance in the process. And so for this part 4, there's not going to be a deliverable per se, except that you may be able to use this work in your classroom data project. So you're going to look in your book at the protocols starting on page 221 and think about how they might be useful to your own setting, which would work better and in what context. And then hopefully these will be of use to you when you're getting into the rest of your assignments in weeks 3 and on. That concludes part 4.